Hey, happy Friday. This week we learned that Apple is losing ground in China, especially to Huawei. Microsoft decided to drop Android apps on Windows, and Apple decided to drop a bomb on Epic. Welcome to the Friday Checkout. This video was sponsored by my streaming service Nebula. We start the brief with Apple announcing M3-powered MacBook Air laptops, bringing the upgraded chip to the company's lowest-priced laptops. It will bring better performance, efficiency, Wi-Fi 6E, and limited dual monitor support to the MacBook Air line, and the new models are starting at $1099 and $1299. And these laptops seem genuinely nice. And in more laptop news, Microsoft announced that it will be hosting an event called New Era of Work on the 21st of March with new Surface, Windows, and Copilot updates. Windows Central says that there will be a Surface Laptop 6 as well as an OLED Surface Pro 10, both of which will come with an Intel Core Ultra as well as Snapdragon X Elite chip options. Apparently the Intel models are going to go on sale in April, whereas the Snapdragon versions will have to wait until June or July, something like that. But I hope that at least in the next couple of weeks we'll see actual benchmarks from an actual laptop. Next, Elon Musk sued OpenAI for not being open enough this week and for turning into a for-profit and befriending a corporate buddy in the form of Microsoft. Hilariously, OpenAI clapped back almost right away with loads of quotes and emails like, quote, Elon wanted majority equity, initial board control, and to be CEO. In the middle of these discussions, he withheld funding. He also apparently agreed that going for profit was necessary while he was there and thought that merging OpenAI into Tesla was actually a great idea. So he wanted a for-profit OpenAI attached to a for-profit giant company, but he also wanted to be completely in control of the entire thing. Kind of undermines his whole argument here. Anyway, moving on, Nothing launched the surprisingly nice Nothing Phone 2A this week. It starts at €329 and it has great cameras, great screens, and great performance, especially for the price. I don't personally love the design, but nice. And also in surprise news this week, Nikon announced that they are acquiring the camera company Red, which makes the cinema cameras that, among many others, Marcus Brownlee and my studio mate Kilian use in their studios too. Interesting. Then EV maker Rivian surprised the press with a new R3 model at its launch event for the R2. The R2 was leaked quite a lot and is a more affordable SUV that is $45,000 for an off-road EV with a range of 330 miles or about 530 kilometers. The R3, meanwhile, was the surprise with crossover-type models, including a higher performance R3X. Interesting. And in really big news, the European Union's Digital Markets and Services Act finally came into power yesterday and forced lots of companies to announce radical changes to their products. Google changed search by, for example, no longer prioritizing Google Flights over its competitors. Facebook allowed consumers to use Messenger without a Facebook account, and Apple pushed through a whole boatload of changes too. These include prompting users to choose a new default browser, including support for third-party browser engines. There's also support to use the iPhone's NFC capabilities for things other than Apple Pay. And of course, there are all the updates to the App Store, as well as alternative App Store payments that we've already covered before. Oh, and Apple also announced plans to make it easier for iOS users to migrate to Android in the future. It announced plans to let users delete Safari and also to let them change the default navigation app. Interestingly, if you leave the EU, you'll actually lose access to a bunch of these things after 30 days, at least on your iPhone, which is pretty wild. But yeah, this feels like a kind of D-Day in software, the big USB-C moment for software. So let's see if this actually changes things and improves the competitive landscape, or if it will just make everything harder to use. And finally, as an unusual ending to the brief, I tried the updated version of the very intriguing Lamo 1. So this is an e-bike with the party trick being that you can remove the so-called smart pack, which has the battery and, by the way, also acts as a portable massive power bank. And then you can also disconnect the clutch from the motor to remove all resistance, and this way you get a nice non-electric bike as well. Kind of 2-in-1. There's a new torque sensor in this year's model, plus also Apple's Find My in addition to GPS, and even a really convenient new phone holder. So the hardware is great, but I sadly found the app to be a little bit clunky compared to most high-end brands. And as a Berliner myself, I also really dislike that Lambo calls themselves a Berlin startup when they very clearly have a kind of Chinese parent or a Chinese subsidiary or some kind of partner who actually does most of the technical work in China. But anyway, the bike itself is very nice. Okay, moving on to my first story of the week, Apple is apparently really losing ground in China and especially to Huawei. The latest data from Counterpoint Research indicates that Apple's sales in China fell 24% year over year in the first 6 weeks of the year, and the company went from first to fourth place in the country. And this happened while Huawei grew 64% in the same period to launch back to the second spot. And if you actually add up Huawei and Honor, they are now at the first spot with 33% again. So this does look very bad for Apple, but I do also want to add a little bit of context. The whole market in China was down 7%, and Oppo's loss was even bigger, so that makes Apple's decline a little bit less dramatic. And 6 weeks is also a really short period, plus it was compared to strong sales from 2023, so there's that. Still, we have 3 reasons to believe that the trouble is actually real. First, other brands like Oppo, for example, release phones at random times more or less during the year, so you can't really compare like a 6-month window this year and the 6-month window from last year and draw a huge conclusion there. But for Apple, you kind of can, because they have a fixed release schedule and that just stays steady. Second, Apple actually also offered discounts on iPhones in China recently, which they almost never do, so that's a real sign of things being shaky. And third, Huawei's revival is directly an Apple problem. Huawei was the Chinese premium phone brand, and while other Chinese brands have flagship models, only Huawei has ever managed to sell them in high volumes. So when Huawei originally collapsed, the entire premium segment was basically open for grabs, which is what Apple jumped on and why the company was so successful in the last few years. But now that Huawei is back with a flagship strategy in China in a major way, almost by definition, the company that they're going to take market share from is going to be Apple. So if Huawei can keep up this flagship strategy, then Apple is going to get hurt. Okay, for my second story of the week, I'm both surprised but also not surprised that Microsoft has decided to kill Android apps on Windows. The Android app support was announced 3 years ago, and in theory it opened up a whole new world of possibilities, but those then never turned into anything major and real. Microsoft launched with the Amazon App Store for Android apps, which means a limited catalog by default versus Google's Play Store dominance. And meanwhile, Google instead set up Google Play Games for Windows, which allows for some Android games to run on Windows, but with a whole different solution. Google has actively tried to hinder Microsoft's platform ambitions many times in the past, so I wouldn't be surprised if that's basically what happened here as well. I also bet that all Microsoft wants to do is to just jam AI into everything on Windows, and spending a lot of resources on trying to make Android apps a thing probably just didn't help there either. And to be honest, I've never used it myself, I've never set it up, I don't know anybody who did, so maybe this is not something that most regular people want, maybe it's just something that a small niche wants. But how about you? Have you used it? Okay, and for my third story of the week, Apple, I think, went absolutely mad over Epic Games. Remember how Apple yanked Epic's developer account during their first big fight over Fortnite? Well, a few weeks ago, news broke that Epic finally got its developer account back again, and we thought that this was likely in response to the new European Union laws that would give Epic the right to build an alternative app store for iOS. But this week we learned that that's not actually what happened at all. Apple claims that Epic Games basically quietly created a new developer account under Epic Games Sweden. But now Apple actually yanked this account too, saying that A, this application was, quote, via a click-through agreement, which had not involved any executive review by Apple, and B, that Epic is verifiably untrustworthy, and that the courts in 2021 ruled them to have the right to terminate any and all of Epic Games' contacts as they wished. So Apple basically said that, hey, actually they didn't realize that Epic made a second account and that the ban is totally still in place. In earlier emails, Phil Schiller said that, quote, your colorful criticism of our DMA compliance plan, coupled with Epic's past practice of internationally violating contractual provisions with which it disagrees, strongly suggests that Epic Sweden does not intend to follow the rules. Now, Epic Games has broken Apple's rules in the past, clearly, but to deny them the option to develop stuff for iOS in the future as well, that's kind of a bold move, especially now. The European Union has just passed new rules explicitly allowing alternative app stores on iOS, and Epic Games was the flagship company that just launched their developer account specifically to launch exactly that, an alternative app store. So unsurprisingly, the EU has just asked Apple to explain themselves and also said that figuring this out is clearly a priority. I think Apple might be technically right and also legally correct in a lot of these cases, but they're also just so petty and so vengeful and so aggressive that I think it is still gonna bite them in the ass somehow. They're clearly going against a lot of things that, for example, regulators want. And oh boy, it sure feels like being completely reliant on this massive corporation above you that you have no control over for your business is kind of a tricky place to be. It's a place that all content creators on the internet find themselves in as well, and that is a big reason for why we created Nebula. Nebula is our very own video streaming platform where we make the rules. And those rules are that we only have really smart educational creators who make the most thoughtful videos on the internet. These creators produce tons of bonus content and Nebula originals and release their regular videos, often with early access on Nebula. And we have also decided that we would fund this whole project with direct subscriptions rather than ads. That means no sponsored reads, no pre-roll ads, no AI-generated garbage, just fantastic videos. I've created a dozen bonus videos and background interviews and also a whole Nebula original series myself. It's called Technorama and it's an 8-part deep dive into classic sci-fi movies and what the technological tropes in them actually say about the times that they were made in. One of my favorite projects that I've ever worked on. Nebula is a really clean trade. You get additional content with no extra distractions and no random low-quality nonsense clogging up your feeds, and we get funds to actually create more content for you. And with my link in the description, you can also get a discount paying just $2.50 a month if you get an annual subscription. That is incredible value for a streaming service if you ask me. So check out Nebula, help us make better content together, and I'll see you next Friday.